Hi everybody, and welcome to the third clone tutorial using Pixeltown 2, AgentCNF's Great City Simulator. In the previous two tutorials, we changed the plots into clones and the build buttons into clones. In this tutorial, we'll look at some of the things we can do now that those things are clones. In between tutorial 2 and tutorial 3, I've made some changes to the code. I want to go over those really quickly. In tutorial 2, I separated the build button building data into these lists. I've added two more lists that hold the data for two other things that are associated with each building. The resale value, which we use in the plot sprite, and the income, which is the amount of money generated each second by each different building type. I use that income in the HUD sprite. Change the money calculation from this long string of calculations into a loop where I go through each of the counts of each building, multiply it by its income to generate the income, and then calculate the money from that. I've also made changes to the plot sprite. I've changed the plot build message handler to update those counts in that building count array. I've also changed the click handler to use that building count array as well, and also use the building resale value from that list when you are selling the building. Now this code is shorter than the original code. This original code may be slightly easier to read, so that's why I add comments to these things so that to the casual observer it makes some sense. Let's stay in the plot sprite for a moment. Now, if we run and look at the board, we see that there are 16 plots. They're arranged in this 4x4 grid. What if we wanted to add more plots? What if we wanted it 5x5 or 6x6? When we had 16 individual plot sprites, it would be hard to add another 9 to get to 25. But in this case, it should be fairly simple to just change this loop to create more sprites. Let's create a dimension variable. And we're going to set that dimension to 4. Where do we use the number 4 in this make plots code? Well, it's here on the row, so I'm going to set it there. And this 15 is actually dimension times dimension minus 1. So this should generate the same pattern. We'll set the dimension to 4, and there we go, that generates the same pattern. Why don't we try setting it to 5? Well, we've now created the 25 plots. Their placing and spacing isn't ideal. So let's look at changing that. We're going to add a few more variables. And first, we're going to set those to the same value that they have in the original. All those come from the place plot code. We'll see that the origin is 170, the X spacing is 60, and the Y spacing is minus 30. So we'll fill those values in. And again, if I make plots now, I should be back to my 4x4 square. There we go. Let's come up with some values for 5. And let's see what happens. There we go, that looks pretty good. We can also do this with 6, 7, 8. We could actually have a dimension of 17 before we start running out of clones. Although I would say if we're going to create that many, there might be a better way of doing this whole process. I encourage you after the tutorial to play with different dimensions and see what you can figure out. Let's go over to the build button now. We're going to create a new building type. Let's add a comment and think about some of the things we're going to need to do to add the building type. Well, one of the things we'll need to do is create a costume. And not only do we need a costume for the build button, we also need the costume for the plot. So let's put that in our comment. Going back to the stage and looking at our data list, we'll obviously have to add one value to each of these data lists to represent that new building. And finally, we will need to place that new button. With 8 buttons, we'll probably just have 2 rows of 4. All right, let's get started with that. So we'll go back to the plot, the costumes. I created the diamond costume earlier, and so I'll just copy that over. And we'll do the same for the build button. Okay, what's next? Add to data lists. Diamond. We'll make it $1 million, but it doesn't generate any income. The score. Let's make it 1,000. The name is diamond. Resale value 0. You can't sell it. And income also 0. All right, back to the build button. Last thing to do is place the buttons. So it's going to be 2 rows of 4, not this sort of weird one. So we're going to change this to 4 and this to 4. And so instead of doing this now on the last one, we're actually going to do that again. Lastly, we need to make sure we're creating 7 clones rather than 6. This will give us the 8 that we're looking for. There we go, there's our diamond building. And we can still build things. Let's give ourselves some money, see if we can buy one of those diamond buildings. And there it is. There's our diamond building. There's a big score. All right. So that ended up being a very simple process to add a build button and to change the number of plots you have. Just for fun, we could make one more change. I'm going to add another costume. And when I bring up the build button, I'm going to create a clone of myself. I'm going to switch costume to that unavailable. I'm going to create a clone of myself. And then I'll switch the costume back to my ID. Now, when I start as a clone, if the costume is unavailable, until the build menu is brought down, we will check to see if we have enough money to purchase the building. Let's try it out. Okay, so we'll get started and bring up the build menu. And we see that the only one available is the shop, so we'll create a shop. And then when we come back into the build menu, we'll see that everything's unavailable. We'll wait for a couple seconds until we get to $500, and the shop becomes available. We'll just give ourselves some more money, and we'll see 2 more become available. There we go. We've just added a completely new feature to the build button. It was really pretty simple because we implemented the build button as clones. I encourage you to go to my site on Scratch, search for LeadToGold, and check out the Clone Tutorial 3 project, which contains all the code I've worked on in these tutorials. Leave your comments and let me know how you like the tutorials and how they can be improved. You can also make your own changes, play with adding plots, create a new building type, or take the multiple person sprites and make them clones. Now, clones are not right for every multiple sprite situation. Sometimes you want each sprite to have its own name, making communication between sprites easier to handle. But if the code for each sprite is mostly the same, and the differences can be expressed as data in a list or a calculated value, then clones might be the right way to go. Also note that Pixeltown 2 was complete and functional before we did any of this work. There are always multiple ways to get the job done, and done correctly. I hope you enjoyed these tutorials and learned something as well. If they were a little above your head, look for my coming series of tutorials, Programming Concepts on Scratch. Thanks again for watching.